So I'd like to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining our CanSolve CKD Knowledge Translation Community of Practice session. My name is Selena Alu, and I'm the Knowledge Translation Broker for the CanSolve CKD Network. And I will be introducing today's session and our speakers very shortly. Joining me today from Vancouver are Graham Pollock and Amanda Green, who will be assisting us in advancing the slides and helping us with any logistic or technical issues. So thank you, Amanda and Graham. The topic for today's presentation is very near and dear to many of us, and we have a lineup of excellent speakers and patient partners, and just looking at those of you who have joined, just a wonderful group of participants as well. So thank you all, and we're really looking forward to telling you a little bit more about patient engagement in knowledge translation, reflections, and opportunities. Next slide, please. So a quick overview of what the session is going to look like today. I'll start off with a quick welcome and introductions and tell you a little bit about knowledge translation within the context of CanSolve CKD. Manuel is going to talk to you about the importance of patient engagement in integrated knowledge translation. And Mary is going to provide some reflections on our experience of patient engagement and knowledge translation. And then we're going to get to hear from Dr. Davina Banner about what opportunities are there for us as patient partners, as researchers, anyone who is vested in this area of kidney health research, for how we could better our processes and reporting around patient engagement and integrated knowledge translation. And like I said, at the end, we'll have some time for some question and answers and some discussion. So feel free to comment in the chat window during the presentations. If you have any questions as well, I'll be monitoring that and bringing it to the attention of the facilitators. And yeah, if you even have any resources that you'd like us to access or like us to know about, feel free to put them in the chat window. Next, please. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am residing in the traditional lands of the Blackfoot and the people of Treaty 7 in Southern Alberta. The city of Calgary, where I am dialing in from, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We will be recording today's 60-minute webinar, and a copy of this presentation with an evaluation and a link to the recording will be sent to you shortly after the session. We ask that you please keep your microphones muted for the duration of the presentation. If you're comfortable, you can leave your video on. That's not a problem. And given that we have 4 presenters today, we ask that you hold your questions right to the end. But again, the chat window is also available to you. Just make sure you address your questions or your comments to everyone. Next, please. Next slide. Thank you. All right, so I'm just going to do a quick round of introductions. I don't want to steal a thunder from the presenters themselves. They'll tell you a little bit more about who they are. So I'd like to start off by introducing Manuel Escoto and Mary Bocage. Both Mary and Manuel are patient partners on our CanSolve Knowledge Translation Committee. Manuel is joining us from Edmonton, Alberta, and Mary from North Bay, Ontario. And it sounds like many of you on this session today know the two of them. They have lived experience with kidney disease and bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to patient-oriented research. Dr. Davina Banner is an associate professor at the School of Nursing at the University of Northern British Columbia. She has a special interest in patient-oriented research and integrated knowledge translation, and it's just such an honor to have her join us today. Next slide, please. Okay, so before we start, very quickly, we'd just like to know who you are. So Amanda, if you could launch the poll. There you go. So are you joining us today as a patient partner or a researcher? Which category best fits your description. Interesting. Well, a large majority of us today are policymakers or decision makers. We have I see patient partners here as well, researchers, some clinicians, research staff. Oh, excellent. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you, Amanda. Could we move on to the next slide, please? Okay. I think if you want to just go back one, please. Okay, wonderful. So the next question that we have for you, and we want to try and just understand why you chose to attend this workshop. So in a couple of words, if you can tell us in the chat why you want to attend this session, or what do you hope to learn today, and it could be any answer. Curiosity, cool. Reaching a wider audience with research results, ensure patient partner engagement in our work, learning best ways to incorporate patient partners into committees and initiatives with Canadian Blood Services. Nice. Patient partner engagement, okay. Let's give maybe one more response. Understand knowledge translation from a patient perspective. I want to learn about centering people's voice in knowledge translation efforts, how to overcome barriers to patient engagement. Okay, wonderful. These are all very insightful and really good reasons to be attending today's session. So hopefully we'll be able to answer many of your questions, and you'll be able to leave with some take-home messages and some practical tips that you can apply in your own work. So thank you very much for that. Okay, next slide, please. Since our topic is around knowledge translation, we wanted to start off by recapping what we know about KT. So knowledge translation is the synthesis, exchange, dissemination, and application of knowledge to improve health, the health system, and health service delivery. So you can see that there are 4 processes that fall under this umbrella of KT. Knowledge synthesis is where total evidence is considered rather than the results of just one study. Knowledge exchange is where the producers and the users of knowledge impart knowledge and learn from each other. Dissemination refers to the different ways that we communicate and share our research findings, and knowledge application is about putting that research into practice. It is also referred to as implementation of knowledge. Next slide. We have 18 research projects at Cancer of CKD, and these projects are generating a significant volume of knowledge and evidence about kidney health, treatment, and care. Now, remember, knowledge translation is about moving that knowledge or that evidence into action, so that translation of evidence really is about moving the needle. When we think of knowledge translation, a lot of people think about publication. And while that is a strategy of dissemination and sharing knowledge, publications alone do not guarantee that the findings are going to be used to improve health. That is why we're committed as a network to not only creating the new knowledge, but making sure that the knowledge gets into the hands of the people who need to use it to affect change. And patient engagement in this process is so vital. Next, please. All right. Next, please. Thank you. A few years ago, we surveyed our network and we came to realize a couple of things. We realized that many of us do not have a common understanding of what knowledge translation is or what are the processes of knowledge translation. And whilst we do have a very collaborative culture of doing patient-oriented research, we need to better understand where patients can meaningfully contribute along the entire research continuum. So not just at the beginning or at the end. And of course, our members also asked us for some practical skills to help them enhance their application of knowledge translation. So at that point, we realized it was time for us to invest in our research teams and particularly in our patient partners. And that's why we created a community of practice. Our community of practice is a virtual learning forum where network members come together on a regular basis to learn and to share practical application of KT. Next, please. And this is what we've learned so far from having a community of practice for just a little under 2 years. One, we've started to connect with each other in much more meaningful ways because think of our 18 projects, we're geographically spread. This has enabled dialogue and we have interests now in solving similar problems. It has stimulated learning through things like sharing resources and even mentoring. We're starting to see greater collaboration, and all of this is starting to lead to a free flow of ideas and information. So today is our 8th Community of Practice workshop, and it is now my pleasure to hand over the reins to our presenters. So I'm going to hand it over to Manuel. You may unmute your microphone.
Well, thanks for that, Selena, and hello to everyone. So Selena mentioned, my name is Manuel, and I'm a patient partner on the CanSolve CKD Knowledge User and Knowledge Translation Committee, also referred to as the KD Committee. In my work with the Kidney Foundation, Northern Alberta and the Territories branch, I engage with patients and caregivers to learn about their experiences, champion health system improvements that address their concern, and raise awareness of kidney health and organ donation using various platforms. Beyond this, my connection to kidney disease is more personal. As a newborn, I was diagnosed with posterior urethral valves. My childhood was filled with major surgeries, long stays in hospital, and many trips to the specialists. A note to my family and I at that point was that this diagnosis would eventually lead to renal failure, which happened when I was 19. After almost 2 years on dialysis, I received a transplant from my mom, and that was over 13 years ago. So while my knowledge of the kidney world spans 3 decades, the concept of patient-oriented research is relatively new to me, and it's one of the reasons why I joined CanSolve. And while I have publicly shared my experiences with many audiences, I've often questioned the value of my singular story. There's always that nagging voice that kept saying, okay, but this is your story, or you shouldn't talk for the entire patient population. I didn't pretend to. I always preface my talks, well, this is my experience, or everybody has a unique perspective. But that voice remained because they heard what I said and they took away my experience. You know, getting diagnosed with kidney failure at 19 and starting dialysis 24 hours later, it was scary and overwhelming. But I will say I mostly had a positive experience. I had a great social network and a strong financial support system. I only had to worry about my health. But I know this isn't the case for everyone, as many patients work towards better health, wellness, but they also have to navigate financial responsibilities and physical and emotional stressors. I hear the stories every day working with the Kidney Foundation. In 2019, I was selected as a kidney health research intern for the Patient Community Engagement Research Program, or PACER. This intensive year-long program empowered me to find my voice and realize the value in my experience. But just as important, it further developed my skill sets in creating safe and inclusive spaces for other patients to do the same. And that's why I'm here. Like many of you, I know my voice as a patient is valuable to research and should be included. And not as an act of tokenism, so a box is checked, but really in a meaningful and collaborative way that shapes the research to benefit people who live with kidney disease and are impacted by transplantation. But I'm also more than my health story. As patients, we have talents outside our journey that can contribute to research. In my case, I have experience in community-based social policy research, in marketing and communications, in public policy, in building strong networks, and facilitating meaningful discussion. I've completed a master's of public health, and it's my goal to bring these experiences and knowledge to the CanSolve network. And I just want to give a shout out to Selena for reminding me that I am more than a patient, and to utilize these strengths to help support CanSolve and the work on the KT committee. And really, this is what integrated knowledge translation, or IKT, is about. It takes patient engagement and patient-oriented research one step further, and is based on the principles of knowledge to action. So for today's session, I will speak to IKT as outlined in Dr. Banner's paper, and how it relates to the network's work. Mary will reflect on her experience with patient engagement and IKT within the CanSolve network. And then comes the very, very exciting part of the session. Mary and I will try to simulate a fireside chat with our content expert, Dr. Davina Banner, who will provide us with additional insights into IKT, patient engagement, and tips for us as researchers and patients on how to integrate these processes into our work. Of course, as Selena mentioned throughout the presentation, I encourage you to use the chat box to write your questions, and we'll address these during the Q&A. Next slide, please. So why is this topic important? Well, as patients and researchers, we need to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of health research, of engaging patients, of knowledge translation? Well, research must be rooted in improving health and system outcomes that address real life needs. And the fact is that having meaningful and collaborative patient-oriented research and patient engagement facilitates responsive and impactful research. As a network, CanSolve is committed to better kidney health by fostering better care, optimal outcomes, and opportunities for meaningful patient participation. Patient-oriented research and knowledge translation are at the core of this work. So for the duration of my presentation, I'll be referring to Dr. Banner's paper, Patient Engagement and IKT. Are we there yet? If you haven't read this paper, like seriously, take some time, read it. It is 100% worth the read. Next slide, please. So IKT is when patients and researchers work collaboratively across the research spectrum, from identifying research priorities to interpreting findings and supporting the use of that research into practice. Patients are involved every step of the way. Researchers who use IKT approaches have reported improvements in health outcomes and health systems. By doing research with patients rather than for them, we recognize that patients' lived experiences are a credible source of knowledge and can help shape impact and can help shape research priorities. And while patients are involved in research, a real and constant concern is that they can't equally influence the research process. But IKT can help balance this relationship between patients and researchers through a commitment of co-leadership, co-production, and collaborative decision-making. By doing so, these processes balance the different power dynamics that one might experience between patients and researchers. One of my favorite quotes of Davina's paper right from the beginning was, "Evidence in isolation is not adequate to drive health system changes. Rather, the broader perspectives of knowledge users, including patients and the public, are needed in order to generate and translate research that is actionable and impactful." So in other words, IKT is really about fostering meaningful and widespread engagement of patients as knowledge users to drive actionable change. And this is really important in light of concerns that research might not always reflect the patient or system concerns, health system concerns. So next slide, please. So if you've been on the CanSolve network, you may have seen the vision statement: listening, learning, and leading, creating better health for Canadians through patient-oriented research. One way CanSolve fosters meaningful patient-oriented research is through our governance structure. So if you look at the organizational chart, you'll see that patients are at the center of all we do. Our ethos is built on the principles of patient inclusiveness, support, mutual respect, and co-building. As you see in the governance structure, CanSolve, as a patient-oriented network, comprises of several committees and councils. The structure is centered around patients, including both the Patient Governance Circle and the Indigenous Peoples Engagement and Research Council. Now, the KT committee is one of 3 core committees. And as Selena mentioned earlier, we support 18 multidisciplinary projects spanning basic science, clinical, and population health research. These 18 projects are organized around 3 themes identified in collaboration with patients, healthcare providers, and policymakers. Theme 1 focuses on earlier diagnosis. Theme 2 speaks to better treatment, and theme 3 is about innovative care. Together, these research projects will close existing gaps in kidney disease knowledge and care to deliver better health outcomes for patients. The KT committee is a core infrastructure of the network, and its mandate is to support knowledge generation, dissemination, and implementation. Next slide, please. So Mary will talk about the work of the KT committee a little bit later, but what I want to highlight is that effective knowledge translation is the foundation of the network. Our goals as a KT committee for kidney health research is to generate awareness, impart knowledge, shape attitudes, inform decision-making, inform policy, and facilitate change. And most importantly, integrating patients into the KT process in a meaningful way allows the network to better understand the needs and priorities of patients. Next slide, please. But are we there yet? You know, it's important to recognize that meaningful patient-oriented research and patient engagement, including IKT, it's not an easy process. There are many challenges associated with this approach and how we do meaningful patient engagement. You know, patient representation and legitimacy are two such challenges. You know, I'm sure you guys have heard these questions. I've often asked these questions myself, but, you know, is my voice alone adequate? How can I speak for an entire population? How do researchers decide who's involved? And are we privileging some voices over others? And as patients, we also need to recognize that we're having our voices privileged, but how do we overcome this? You know, in my work with the Kidney Foundation, we often rely on a small population of key patients who are always willing to step up and share their voice. This is fantastic, and we value their opinion. But this also limits the diversity and representation because we're not receiving experiences that differ based on a person's culture, ethnicity, social factors, and other demographic factors. Now, these aren't new insights. Likely all of you are aware of these challenges, but we can overcome some of these barriers. Now, again, I said this earlier, I encourage everyone to read and reread Avina's paper because it does provide us with a roadmap for improving our patient-oriented research framework, for improving the research process, and ultimately improving patient health and system outcomes. So now with that, I will pass it over to Mary now, who is also a patient partner in the KT committee, and she will discuss these processes in action.
Thank you, Manuel. Anin hello, bonjour. Mary Bocage Nijdakas, Nibising Dunjaba, Makwadondem. I greeted you in my traditional greeting. My name is Mary Bocage. I'm from Nipissing First Nation, which is in Robinson Huron Treaty Territory, and I'm from the Bear Clan. My introduction to CKD was dramatic. I had a crash start in 2013 and was in a coma for 4 days. I was dialyzed daily. When I woke up, I didn't remember much, but I knew my reality had changed. I began my dialysis routine, and not long after, my Auntie Angie joined me. She was 83 and I was 44. I also saw other people from my community coming and going for the same reason on different shifts. My auntie and others have since passed on to the spirit realm. Sadly, more people will fill those dialysis chairs. As I sat in that chair, I had a lot of time to reflect. I thought about other members of my family who sat in chairs like these over the years. I gazed out the window in my clinic and I could see my First Nation just meters away. I'm a big picture thinker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than me. My Indigenous worldview showed me that my responsibility and obligation to make a difference started with this journey. I knew that if I was meant to have a transplant, that I would do all I could to make a difference in the lives of people with CKD. In 2015, I had that transplant. It was a special gift from my cousin Janice. Being part of this Can Solve CKD network since our first official meeting in Halifax in 2016 has allowed me and others to be agents of change in what patient engagement looks like and how research is being done across Canada. It's brought people together who share that bond of CKD. Part of what I love to do is share knowledge and tell stories. So becoming part of the KT committee was a natural fit for me, even if I didn't fully realize what KT was about. My background was in retail management, where I excelled in service both to my customers and staff. If my staff wanted to learn and excel, I gave them opportunities. I had a passion for recruiting, hiring, coaching, training, and mentoring, tools that have translated and served me well in my career, and as well as being part of being a patient partner, communicating with different stakeholders. As I learned more about KT, I realized that using Twitter was one good way to share information about what was going on in CanSolve CKD and other aspects of patient engagement. The focus of my portion of this presentation today will be to reflect on the CanSolve CKD experience with patient engagement and knowledge translation, and what we have done so far as a network. Next slide. Here's a lovely picture of the KT committee at one of our in-person meetings in Calgary 2018. It seems so long ago. I know there's like people close together in a picture and there's no masks. It's just really weird. Anyway, our committee expertise included researchers, policymakers, KT experts, patient partners, project managers, clinicians, so it was a good mix of people. Some things I want to highlight about our committee's trajectory over the last few years. Our work for year 1 and 2 was mainly to meet in person to review the KT plans and provide feedback on the 18 projects. In year 3 and 4, we enhanced the KT capacity for our network and for the work to come. We established the KT community of practice, lots of knowledge translation dissemination, learning webinars, consultation with CanSolve project teams, etc. In year 4, 2019, at our annual meeting, our projects presented visual summaries as an update to their KT plans. In years 5 and 6, there was a rollout of there will be a rollout of an implementation toolkit. We are at the key considerations and components of planning for evidence dissemination and implementation. Next slide, please. In a paper that we recently submitted, we talk about the 4 main areas of the KT committee and how it supports patient engagement in integrated knowledge translation, or IKT. The first quadrant talks about knowledge generation. The second talks about knowledge dissemination. And then the third, with the rollout of the implementation toolkit I spoke of earlier, we will support patient engagement and how knowledge is implemented or put into use. And the fourth and last quadrant refers to patient engagement and how it's also vital to sustaining the use of knowledge. For example, ongoing monitoring and evaluation of any intervention will be key. In the next few slides, I will highlight some tangible examples from our 18 projects. Next slide. Earlier, Selena defined KT as processes that help us bridge the gap between what we know and what needs to be done. The knowledge to action framework, K2A cycle, is used to ensure we stay true to the principles of integrated KT. The cycle explains how knowledge translation is done. The knowledge funnel in the center is where knowledge is created, and the 7 phases that show us how knowledge is to be used in real life. The knowledge funnel outlines 3 steps of how knowledge is created. It is created through knowledge inquiry, think randomized clinical trials, knowledge synthesis, think of scoping reviews, and the development of knowledge tools and products, such as clinical practice guidelines. As we move down the funnel, knowledge is refined and made more useful. The 7 phases show us how that knowledge can be applied. Next slide, please. I am now going to show you some examples of CanSolve CKD projects that exemplify patient engagement across the K2A cycle. First is the Kidney Check project. It used mobile lab equipment to screen and test for CKD and its risk factors in Indigenous communities. The information is then used to determine an individual's risk of CKD, and each person receives an individualized treatment plan. When the study protocol was being designed, patient partners felt strongly that denying 50% of community members access to the intervention was unethical, so the protocol changed to include the whole community. Patient partners also assisted in selecting and engaging with communities for the intervention. They also insisted on reframing the study from a message of illness to a message of wellness. This is all rooted in relationship and trust building, especially to work in overcoming the historic fear of researchers coming into community. Patient partners have helped develop animation tools in Cree to assist in communicating about Kidney Check in Manitoba. They helped with the design of the Kidney Check logo, the website and social media links and content, as well as reviewing communication materials and the creation of education materials. Next slide, please. Patients on hemodialysis take 12 medications per day on average. Stop Med HD is researching ways to help reduce the use of medications that lack evidence for effectiveness and safety in hemodialysis patients. In addition to patient partners on the project, co-developing patient information tools, 3 patient partners actively participated in conducting interviews at dialysis clinics. There was a patient who was resistant to speaking to researchers. He wouldn't open up. One of the patient partners sat with him once everyone else had moved on and shared a bit of their caregiver story. It was meaningful enough to this patient that he started sharing. This was proof enough that the patient partners were vital in this step in the research. Next slide. Patient partners in the self-management project were instrumental in identifying knowledge gaps in how to better self-manage their kidney disease. Using patient consensus approaches and personas, they co-created a website to support patient self-management of CKD. Personas are fictitious descriptions of users used to represent hypothetical patients with CKD and caregivers with the aim of facilitating discussion among all participants. They developed the personas as an archetypical representation of real and potential e-health tool users to illustrate their characteristics. For example, needs, skills, behaviors, motivations, frustrations, and goals. Next slide. The Living Kidney Donation Project is looking at innovative solutions to help overcome barriers to living donor transplantation. One of the 4 strategies is TAP, the Transplant Ambassador Program, an example of a patient-led initiative. So with the advent of COVID and the capacity for our TAP ambassadors to not be in clinic with patients, the Transplant Ambassador Program had to look at different avenues. So they decided to go virtual. They pivoted to respond to the patient needs in the wake of COVID-19. By listening to patient needs, they adapted from in-person connections to virtual. The TAP team provided contextual insights and perspectives as both users of the program and delivering TAP in clinics. It was important to continue, to pivot and provide the intervention no matter what. Creating and implementing the Profile Project helped the core team highlight TAP ambassadors on social media and was a way for us to better match patients with ambassadors. Taking TAP to Zoom Healthcare was one way the team adapted to delivering the program virtually. Next slide, please. iCare is a study designed to address the extremely high rates of early kidney damage in Indigenous youth with type 2 diabetes. In order to make the youth feel more comfortable in clinics, the iCare team piloted 2 new tailored interventions. The first was the practice of engaging an elder who facilitates a sharing circle and provides cultural support to patients together with their families and clinical staff. And the second was utilizing a patient booklet initiated by the patient advisory group to improve diabetes self-management. Next slide, please. Here's another good diagram that shows the progression of patient engagement through the research cycle. It starts with who. which is meaningfully engaged patient partners. The what is multidisciplinary research teams. The how is engagement across all the research cycles. And the why, or the outcome, is improved health. Next slide, please. I will now hand over the next section to Davina Banner. Davina will highlight some key opportunities for how we can take patient engagement and IKT to the next level. She will share some valuable tips and advice. Welcome, Davina. Before we start, we would all love to hear a little more about who you are and how you came to be interested in this subject.
Oh, thank you so much, Mary, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me. So my name's Davina. I'm a researcher and I'm based at the University of Northern British Columbia in a very snowy Prince George. And I live here, and it's on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Lheidli T'enneh, and I'm very grateful to be an uninvited guest here. I'm also an educator and a palliative care nurse, and my journey into patient-oriented research and IKT came early in my career, where as a practitioner transitioning into research, I wanted to find those better ways to work together.
Perfect. Well,
Thank you, Davina. I'll now turn it over to Manuel.
yeah, thank you, Davina, for joining us today. I think everybody here is really lucky to learn from you and to listen to you.
I hope so.
Let's just get started with our simulated fireside chat. I think I should have changed my virtual background to reflect that, but it's too late now. Let's get on with it. So, first I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us today. I think it's really amazing to have so many folks from across Canada join us, because it really speaks to the importance of patient-oriented research and patient engagement. Now, in reading your paper, I noted that, there's a lot of enthusiasm for this work and its processes, but there's more work that needs to be done to understand how these approaches, in fact, support the development and use of research into practice, which ultimately improves patient care. So in your paper, you talk about patient engagement processes, outputs, and inputs. Can you help us understand the differences of each and give us an example of each?
Sure. So it's quite a big topic, so I'll be as brief as I can, but I think as already demonstrated today through both Manuel and Mary's sharing, that patient engagement offers a tremendous opportunity in the context of research for us to really get down to the level of focusing on research that addresses patients' values and needs and priorities, and that in itself can be impactful. And so we know that gaps between that knowledge and action can be quite extensive. We know that it takes a long time for evidence to be integrated in practice, and that the changes don't always come in the way that we want. And so in recent years, we've had a real emergence and a focus on patient engagement. And in Canada, that's through the CHR SPORE movement, where patient is an inclusive term, so patients, caregivers, families, and friends. And that's really focused on developing meaningful partnerships with patients, working together to identify and to bring forward those needs and values. But also we've seen a movement in this integrated knowledge translation, which in itself is a model of collective practice. And so the two are quite distinct, but they're also fairly similar here. And so my interest was really spurred in how do these approaches meld together, especially when we know through research that teams are often not just a patient, partner, and a researcher. They're multiple people and multiple knowledge users. And so really, really interested in that process. But what makes for great processes that in turn turns to outputs and impacts is still quite hard to determine, not only because we're really, I think, still in our infancy of what those partnerships mean, but also because it's quite challenging to establish those evaluations and impacts more broadly. So we know through our processes that when we work in collaboration and in meaningful partnership with patients through those processes, we know that the research becomes more democratic in nature, it's more humanized, and when we work together, we can ask questions that we hope are the right questions and tackle the issues that are of priority for patients. So I think it's fair to say that when it starts and ends with the patients, it's probably the best recipe, and is really something that inspires us all, I think, to do more. So when we talk about the processes, part of the biggest piece of that is breaking that down to consider our relationships and how we partner meaningfully and how we create the environment for the partnership. And now when we talk about outputs and impacts, I think that's where we get into a little more new territory, and we're still learning. And so outputs, and you've raised some fantastic examples already from the CANSOLV CKD network, which I'm very grateful to be partnering with too. And so those outputs in terms of focusing on research that tackles areas of importance to the patient community, but also how do we make sure that's impactful in our knowledge translation. And so far the evidence base around both patient-oriented research and integrated knowledge translation is still really developing. We're still coming to understand what practices are most promising and when and why and how they work. And there has been a much more increasing focus on the methods of engagement, and it's something that I'm really passionate about, but still consider myself to be learning in principle, because I see every research partnership as unique and each partnership as an opportunity to learn from each other and together. And I think as we move forward, when we think about impacts, those are perhaps the newest of all territory. Like, how do we know that when we partner together, that this does lead to impactful change? And I think my response to that has always been principally that our evidence base may be considered weak, but I think it's emerging, and we're already seeing evidence and impact. So, you know, improved focus of topics of relevance to patients, as well as improved study procedures such as recruitment, and also improvements in knowledge translation. But even in the wake of an evidence base that's developing, I think most people will agree that when we work together as researchers, as patients, as frontline providers, as policymakers, as community members, it's that connection that often feels right. And so even in its own intrinsic value, I think most people are very positive about continuing. And I think other parts that are emerging too is around the use of evaluation. And so there are some tools that are emerging, such as the GRIP2, and there's the peers framework, for instance, where we can start asking questions about this process and the outputs and impacts. And I wonder, Mary, you'd mentioned such a great deal of examples, and I think CANSOLV is a network that's been incredibly inspiring and has taken a real leadership position in engaging patients and caregivers and communities. In terms of your view on outputs and impacts, where would you like to see the field move?
Well, I'll start by saying it took a while to build relationships and to build that trust even between patient partners and researchers, and to have that that ability to even feel comfortable in asking questions or bringing suggestions to the table. I think I'd like to see more collaboration at implementation stages. I mean, we started with CANSOLV, and the projects were already in place, and there had been some patient engagement before we had been approved for our grant. But I think too, just even in the projects themselves, I think there could be more opportunity for implementation and engagement with patients right from the beginning. And that's kind of where I'd like to see things go.
Absolutely.
I really love those comments, Mary. And just a quick note of what you said earlier, Davina, about the definition of a patient and how it encompasses everybody, not just the patient itself. I mean, speaking from my own personal journey, I know that what I've gone through doesn't just impact me. I know my whole family, my friends have, different perspectives as to what was going on, and 100% their opinions and their values are so important to this research. Kind of going back to what you were just saying, Mary, about the need for patient engagement. I'm wondering, Davina, before we move into the Q&A portion, so if anybody has questions, put them in the Q&A, but what kind of tips or tools do you have, or can you suggest for us to improve this process?
I think one of the tools I really like to use myself is the AP2 Spectrum of public participation, and I'm not sure if people are necessarily super familiar with this, but it's something that I find that's really usable and usable across a whole team. And so, and there are others, and for instance, there's Carmen, a model by Carmen and so forth. And so there's some really great models of engagement, but this is one that I really enjoy because I find it's very practical and it gives very good tips. And I think what you'll see across the top is that we see that there are these different levels of engagement that range from inform, consult, involve, collaborate, and empower. And in the context of IKT research, because it is that collective partnership and that co-production, the goal will always be ideally to be in that collaborate piece. So this is this model to me helps me as a benchmark, and certainly as through a research process, this is often a tool where we can look at, where are we in terms of that engagement and what does that look like? However, I really wanted to say that I think every partnership has its unique flavor and its unique feel. Because we're all different, we all bring our different perspectives to the table. And so, and I think it's also important to say that engagement ebbs and flows anyway, whether you're a researcher or a knowledge user, and not every member of the team can always at all times maybe be in that collaborative space. And and I think from my own experience through partnerships, if we're co-leading a project with a patient partner or a family member and so forth, or have a team of patients involved, we have to be cognizant that people are sharing those perspectives because of their own health journey, their own experiences, and we need to create spaces that make it safe for people to participate. So if people are dealing with health conditions and maybe there's times when their health condition, their health needs take priority. And so I always say we have to be cautious of saying that there is one model of partnership that is the correct way, and recognize the ebbs and flows, but give the space for people to participate as they can. And so part of that big thing for me is the space for patient partners that, if their health needs change or their engagement abilities change at any point, that it doesn't mean that they fall out of the process. And also, from, when we partner with healthcare providers or decision makers, and COVID is a great example, where people's priorities get changed and pulled, they may have to rapidly respond. So partnerships are as much about that meaningful connection, sharing those goals, sharing those visions, but also I think having that flexibility and allowing that unique flavor to come through. And so I really see this as a great benchmarking point, but I also recognize that people's needs may change over the time. And also, and Manuel, earlier you mentioned about wondering about those voices, your voice and your contributions. And I think, again, that no one size fits all in teams. Like, all of us are bringing our own unique experiences and perspectives. And a patient cannot speak to an entire community of a patient community, for instance, just as much as a researcher or a healthcare provider cannot speak to an entire community of of evidence or practice and so forth. And so I think when we all come together, it's having those conversations about where we fit, where our expertise are, and so forth. And so I always go back to the fact that if it feels right and it feels safe and it feels joyful and courageous, you're probably close to that great recipe. And I know, Mary, you've had a lot of experience too. And are there any ingredients that you see as being like really central to that partnership process?
I think communication is really important. I think too, and you touched on it when you spoke earlier, Manuel, that we're more than just our illness. We do have transferable skills, and we do have other things that we can bring to the table as well. And I know it's so easy to look at us as strictly patients, but we have other things that we can contribute that that help make a more meaningful make a meaningful impact.
Yeah, 100%. And that's why I gave the shout out to Selena, because, when I first came on with CanSolve, I saw myself 100% in that patient role, because that is, quote unquote, what I signed up for. But, again, Selena is telling me, no, you have experience in this, you have experience that, like bring those perspectives out. And I mean, getting that encouragement is one of the reasons why I love the work I'm doing here with CanSolve. So again, Selena, thank you for that. I just have, I just have a quick follow-up, Davina, on some of what you've talked about today, and then what your paper goes into, this emphasis on collaboration, co-production, really engaging patients along the spectrum. And we've talked about values that I think we can all agree upon today. It has to be joyful, as you said, but, what advice would you give patients or researchers, should they find themselves in a position where they don't see eye to eye on the direction of a specific project, because that is real life and that can happen sometimes.
Yeah, and that's a good one, and I think as teams that's always a potential, and often there are conversations that need to happen, and whether it's decisions on directions of research or similar. And so it's a really good piece, but I think for me it goes back to that relational factor that most partnerships can weather that if the relationship building is that there's a relationship built from the start, and that there's a continued attention and intention to work together and to share. I think as researchers that often means leaving our ego at the door, and really validating and being intentional in our work to learn from experiential knowledge, and to act on it too. And I think when we look at our shared perspectives and through a relationship lens, I think we can often weather some of those conversations. I think at the start, my one tip would be is as those relationships are building, is to be really clear about the goals of the research. And I can see that there are a few really great comments about it too, is like being really clear on the purpose of the project, the scope of the relationship, what might be expected. But I think it's really important for patient partners to be supported, to think about, for instance, what does the partnership mean to them? How does it fit with your goals, your dreams, your desires? Like what? And I think when we look at it from everybody's perspective and what everybody has to gain, I think we can really move forward with a renewed sense of purpose of working together. And then I think if tensions come through, hopefully through that relationship process and creating safe spaces for people to share and support. So backtracking a little bit, I think the safe space is being able, is creating a space where everybody's voice is valued and heard, ensuring that people are fully prepared and supported, and that they know that if there is a problem, they have a point person to go to. And then I think if there is disagreement, that there is an investment in the relationship to talk through it in an open and honest way and work to a solution. And so I think I always go back to that relational piece is, you know, how we foster connection together and safety to work together. Yeah, and just being really open and honest. And but yeah, it can be difficult. It's not an easy process by any means.
Fantastic. No, these are great insights, and I do not want to cut you off, but I also want to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions. So if you have a question, unmute yourself, raise your hand, type it in the chat box, and we will get to them. And as people are doing that, I'll just follow up with one other small question. Maybe not so small. There's this concern about, you know, the role of patients and adhering to, you know, the scientific method, the research method, right? So what opportunities are there out there, or tips that you would suggest that develop a patient's capacity to take out that research that adheres to, you know, some of that evidence-based methodology that folks or researchers might want to stick to?
So it's a really good question. I mean, I think the first thing is that when we work collectively and we work together, hopefully it won't necessarily be about what researchers on their own want to stick to. I think, how do I answer that one? Well, I think in terms of one of the parts of meaningfully partnering together is just ensuring that people are supported to participate. And so one of the things personally that I spend a lot of time on is kind of orientation to the project. And so I will work in partnership right from the conceptualization. So I will maybe come with some ideas, or sometimes the ideas come directly from the patient partners, which has been the case for me in my last funded research. And then we collectively develop questions, and then as we go, so it's, you know, asking the question, what do you need to participate? So maybe it's training, maybe it's support to use particular computer programs, or some of the other things I've been developing is some methods tool that explains, for instance, this is what analysis looks like. And so this is some of the language. So as researchers attending to the jargon and taking that out, but also providing the training to help people kind of connect with the process. And then the conversation to say, like, is there a different way to do this? And so it can't always be the researcher's way. Like, we have to, working together means building together.
Fantastic. You know what? We have a question here, which I'll read out to you. So what is one tip you would give to a researcher starting out on the journey of doing IKT? And what tips would you give to a patient starting out as well? Great question.
Yeah, so maybe, Mary, do you want to speak to the patient bit first, or the?
Sure. I would say try not to feel intimidated. Don't be afraid to ask questions. You're going to run into a lot of jargon, acronyms, things like that you don't understand. And sometimes it makes you feel like you know less than you do. And it's probably true. But there's nothing wrong with asking questions with clarification and trying to understand, and even just the whole routine. I remember, for instance, with our projects, none of us as patient partners knew about, the ethics board approval. So then we didn't hear from people for a month. So, or months, not just a month, but months. And there was no movement, there was no communication. So we're like, okay, is this still going on? Like, what's happening? So if you don't hear from anybody, reach out to your coordinator and find out what's going on. And likewise, on the other side of that, as a coordinator, getting used to, or at any point in your patient engagement journey from that side of the table, just let your patient partners know that nothing's happening right now. Even if it's just a quick email saying, okay, just to get you up to speed, we're still waiting for ethics review and whatnot, or this, that, and the other thing. And, when things are happening, we'll let you know. you know, and sort of maybe explain that bit of the process a bit. But and that's where I talked about communication earlier, and I think that that's really important.
And I think I'd like to pick up on that IKT as a newer researcher, and I should say this work was funded through a CHR Foundation grant, and I'm very privileged to be working with the Integrated Knowledge Translation Research Network, and Dr. Ian Graham, I've been a visiting scientist working with, and so this paper was one of the concept papers for the network, and so I think one of the biggest pieces is connecting to the IKT community, and as a new researcher, seeking out those mentors that can help you. I think there's a little bit of a leap of faith. I think as researchers, we're kind of conditioned to want to control. And I think through patient-oriented research and IKT, that there is something joyous about, you know, really kind of leaning into that collective spirit and allowing yourself to experience something new. And quite a funny example that I have is somebody, Barbara, who I co-lead a project with on stroke and brain injury, and we were doing patient journey mapping, and it was for our Provincial Health Service Authority, but the patient journey mapping just didn't have the same vibe, and she kept bringing me art, and I just remember thinking, oh my god, it's going to be an art thing and I can't draw a stick figure, like I can't do this. And so we just took the leap of faith and we did this pretty huge community arts based sharing and learning circles, and I think it was one of the most amazing experiences of my career and transformative, like on a professional and personal level. So I would just say, you know, get some mentorship, you know, read great examples, and then just jump in, heart, soul, mind, and let it take you where it takes you.
Amazing. Yeah, perfect. I'll just add one thing to that. I know we've talked about it before, but I think one of the things I can add, you know, for patient partners is, and I'm guilty of doing it, but don't question the value in your story. You know, researchers want to understand, you know, your journey. Like that is what is guiding research. So, I mean, like I said, I've questioned it myself, but please don't do that. Just there is power, and you know, finding organizations such as CanSolve that empower you to share your story. You know, I think there's also opportunities out there available for, you know, patients to get involved. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I was part of the PACER program, and I will say I probably learned more in the PACER program about the value of the story, about research methodology than I did during my MPH. I will forever be grateful for that program, because now, you know, I wear two hats. Now I am a patient, but I'm also a patient health researcher. So I think there are opportunities out there if you want to develop those skill sets. And I mean, if there's any questions, you know, anybody of us would be happy to guide you to some of those opportunities. But just being mindful of time, and again, I don't want to end the conversation, but I'm just being mindful of time. So I think we're gonna close it down. I don't see any more questions. If we can just go to the next slide. So I just want to thank everybody for attending the webinar. I hope the webinar did provide value for the time that you took off and spent with us. It was an hour and we very much appreciate it. I want to say big thank you to Selena, Mary, Davina for participating in today's webinar, for your insights and expertise. A big thank you to the true superheroes behind the scenes, Graham and Amanda, for ensuring that the webinar ran smoothly. So we will email you the slide deck and evaluation shortly. We really hope you do take the time to complete it, as it helps us improve and prepare for our next webinar. The recording will be available on the CanSolve website. And if you haven't signed up already for the CanSolve network, please take a moment to do so. Take you 30 seconds and you'll be up to date on all the fantastic work that this network is doing. Also follow us on social media. So we are still open and available for questions. The CanSolve email is on the slide, so feel free to contact us at any point. If you have specific questions to any of the presenters, they will be redirected to us. And I just want to say again, thank you for joining us in this webinar. We really appreciate you joining us and spending some time with us. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Manuel.